30%. That is the number that stopped researchers cold. 30% of the immune cells in a healthy human body located not in the blood, not in the lymph nodes, but lining the walls of the gut. One organ, one long folded tube, nearly a third of your entire immune defense, standing watch in a place most people only think about when something goes wrong. And here is what they will tell you next, if you keep reading the same journals. That number has been dropping, not because of genetics, because of what we stopped eating about 70 years ago. Stay with me, because before this is over, I am going to tell you about a Korean monastery where monks have been eating the same meal every morning for 400 years, and what researchers found when they finally analyzed it. And I am going to tell you about a man in a 16th century German hospital whose case was recorded in enough detail that modern gastroenterologists have gone back and read it and called it, in print, a precise description of intestinal permeability, a condition they are only now beginning to treat with the same compounds his physicians prescribed. That story is going to change what you think about the word ancient. But first, the principle underneath everything else in this script. Fermentation is not preservation. That is not what it is. Preservation is about keeping something from dying. Fermentation is about making something more alive. Bacteria, yeasts, fungi, working in the dark over days and weeks, breaking down what a human stomach cannot, manufacturing compounds that do not exist in the raw ingredient, building a chemistry that your gut was designed to receive and use. God put that process in the world before He put people in it. That is not an accident. That is architecture. There is a monastery outside Suncheon in the South Cholla province of Korea, where monks have been making doenjang the same way since the early 17th century. The soybeans are boiled, shaped into blocks, hung with rice straw because the straw carries the wild Bacillus subtilis natto, and left through winter. Then salt, then time, months of it. The result is a dark, dense, almost geological paste that bears almost no chemical resemblance to the soybeans it started as. When researchers from Seoul National University analyzed the traditional doenjang from monasteries like this one against commercially produced versions, the difference was not subtle. The traditionally fermented paste contained measurable quantities of nattokinase, an enzyme first isolated from natto, the Japanese fermented soybean, and now studied in cardiovascular research for its demonstrated activity in breaking down fibrin, the protein that forms arterial clots. The commercial version, produced at speed and at scale, contained almost none. The compound does not survive industrial heat treatment. It requires time and the right bacterial community. The monks had both. The factory had neither. The monks were not trying to make a cardiovascular compound. They were making food. They were doing what their teachers taught them to do, and their teachers had learned it from theirs. But the result, studied in a laboratory 40 miles away and 4 centuries later, was a food that does something very specific to blood and vessels. They did not have a laboratory. They had something better. Generations of people watching what happened to other people who ate the same thing every morning for a lifetime. Let us talk about the gut itself, because most people have a vague and not quite accurate picture of what it is. The gut is not a passive tube. It is a surface, roughly the size of a tennis court when fully unfolded, lined with cells that make constant decisions about what to let through and what to keep out. Those cells are connected by structures called tight junctions. When the tight junctions are intact and functioning, the barrier holds. Nutrients pass through in controlled ways. The immune system gets clean information. When the tight junctions begin to loosen, for reasons that include alcohol, certain medications, processed food emulsifiers, and a catastrophic reduction in dietary fiber, the barrier becomes permeable. Partially digested proteins, bacterial fragments, and inflammatory signals begin crossing into the bloodstream. The immune system, encountering things that do not belong, responds accordingly, chronically, systemically, in ways that show up as fatigue, as joint pain, as skin inflammation, as mood disruption, as autoimmune patterns that take years to trace back to their source. Here is what almost no one mentions when they discuss fermented foods. The primary mechanism is not the bacteria themselves. It is what the bacteria produce in the process of fermentation. Short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate. Butyrate is the preferred fuel source of colonocytes, the cells that line the colon. When colonocytes are well fueled, they maintain tight junctions, they regulate inflammation, they signal the immune cells standing behind them to stand down. A randomized controlled trial published in the journal Gut found that butyrate supplementation significantly improved barrier function in patients with Crohn's disease. Not cured, but measurably clinically improved. Butyrate is not a drug. It is what bacteria make when they ferment fiber. It is what your gut has been waiting for since the day you were born. The German hospital record I mentioned at the beginning belongs to a man whose name has not survived the 4 centuries between his illness and our reading of it. What survived is the description. Wasting, swelling of the abdomen, irregular stools carrying undigested matter, fatigue so severe he could not stand without assistance. His physicians, working in the tradition of Paracelsus, prescribed what their training recommended: fermented cabbage, sauerkraut, prepared in the old way, lacto fermented with salt and thyme, not vinegar, 3 times daily, alongside small amounts of fermented milk from a local dairy. Within 6 weeks, by the record, he was standing. Within 3 months, working. That is not symbolism. In modern terms, specifically in what gastroenterological research now understands about intestinal permeability, that is a precise clinical description of a gut barrier in collapse. Undigested matter in the stool indicates enzymatic insufficiency. Abdominal swelling suggests dysbiosis and gas production from fermentation of the wrong substrates by the wrong bacteria. The fatigue that makes standing difficult is consistent with systemic inflammatory load and mitochondrial suppression from chronic endotoxemia. What his physicians prescribed was not random. Lacto-fermented cabbage contains Lactobacillus plantarum, a strain that has now been shown in multiple peer-reviewed trials to reduce intestinal permeability, lower circulating endotoxin levels, and directly upregulate the expression of tight junction proteins at the cellular level. Fermented milk, in its traditional form, contributed Lactobacillus acidophilus, whey proteins, and bioavailable minerals that a damaged intestinal lining cannot absorb from raw food alone. They were not guessing. They were reading from a pharmacopoeia, written not in ink but in outcomes. Centuries of sick people getting better when given these specific preparations. Proverbs 2:6. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. There is a kind of knowledge that arrives before the vocabulary to describe it. These physicians had it. The vocabulary came later. The knowledge was already there. Kefir. Not the sweetened, stabilized, commercially filtered product sitting under fluorescent lights in American grocery stores, but traditional kefir, made from living grains passed between families across the Caucasus Mountains for more than 1,000 years, contains somewhere between 30 and 50 distinct microbial species, depending on the specific grain culture. Commercial kefir typically contains 2 to 5. The grain, which looks like a small cauliflower, is a symbiotic community. Bacteria and yeast living together in a polysaccharide matrix, producing lactic acid, acetic acid, carbon dioxide, and a range of bacteriocins, which are antimicrobial peptides that suppress pathogenic bacteria without destroying the broader microbial community. One of those bacteriocins, nisin, has been studied extensively for its activity against Listeria, Staphylococcus aureus, and Clostridium species. It does not appear in the commercial version because the filtration and standardization process that gives commercial kefir its uniform texture removes the grain community entirely. Here is what almost no one mentions about kefir. The polysaccharide matrix of the grain itself, the kefirin, has demonstrated activity in separate research lines against elevated blood glucose. A study from the University of Lodz in Poland found that kefirin supplementation in diabetic rats produced significant reductions in fasting blood glucose and improvements in insulin sensitivity, results researchers describe as warranting continued investigation in human populations. This is not the bacteria. This is the matrix that holds the bacteria, the part most commercial production discards, the part families in the Caucasus have been consuming every morning, with bread, for longer than the Ottoman Empire lasted. Kimchi is almost always discussed in terms of lactobacillus kimchi and the general benefits of fermented vegetables. That is the surface of it. Go deeper and you find something more specific. Traditional kimchi contains gochugaru, Korean red pepper, which during fermentation undergoes enzymatic transformation that increases the bioavailability of capsaicin metabolites by a factor measurable in laboratory assay. It contains garlic, which under fermentation produces S-allalcysteine, a sulfur compound that does not exist in raw garlic in significant quantities, but appears during aging, and which has demonstrated neuroprotective activity in research from Kyunghee University. It contains ginger, whose shogaol content, the heat-converted form of gingerol, more bioavailable and more potent as an anti-inflammatory than its precursor, increases across the fermentation period. Kimchi is not a preserved vegetable. It is a slow-reaction vessel in which multiple compounds are being transformed into forms the body can use that did not exist in the raw ingredients. The Joseon Dynasty Court maintained official kimchi preparation records. Officials were assigned to oversee the process. This was not superstition about old food. This was institutional recognition that the preparation method produced something that raw vegetables did not. They could see the outcomes. They could not see the chemistry. We can now see both. Miso deserves more than it typically receives in this conversation. Most people think of it as a Japanese soup base. It is a 300-year pharmaceutical tradition that also happens to make soup excellent. The Aspergillus oryzae mold used in miso production does something unusual. It produces proteases that break soy protein down into free amino acids and bioactive peptides, including one called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. Low GABA activity is associated with anxiety, insomnia, and hyperreactivity. The GABA in traditionally fermented miso is bioavailable in ways that synthetic GABA supplements may not be, because the fermentation matrix in which it exists appears to support intestinal absorption. Researchers at Hiroshima University studying the aftermath of atomic bomb survivors found that populations consuming miso soup daily showed statistically lower rates of radiation-related illness, results that generated decades of research into the specific radioprotective compounds miso contains, including genistein isoflavones and specific melanoidins formed only during the Maillard reactions of long fermentation. Long fermentation is the critical phrase. Traditional hacho miso, the darkest, densest variety, made in cedar barrels under stone weights in Okazaki, Japan, ferments for a minimum of 3 years. What it contains at the end of 3 years is not what it contained at the beginning. The modern version, white miso, produced in weeks, is a different substance with a different chemistry and a fraction of the bioactive depth. In the book of Deuteronomy, the land promised to Israel is described as a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, of olive oil and honey. Every item in that list, in traditional preparation, passes through fermentation. Wheat and barley becomes sourdough, a 12 to 36 hour lactic acid fermentation that partially breaks down gluten, degrades phytic acid from the grain, and produces organic acids that lower the glycemic response of the bread by a measurable margin. Vines become wine, a multi-stage fermentation that produces resveratrol, quercetin, and tartaric acid in bioavailable forms. Figs and pomegranates were fermented in ancient Israel into preparations whose specific chemistry is only now being examined by archaeologists working with organic residue analysis. Olive oil does not ferment, but its polyphenol content, and specifically oleocanthal, which inhibits the same enzymatic pathway as ibuprofen at comparable concentrations, is highest in the biophenol-rich varieties that modern industrial production blends away in favor of a milder, more commercial flavor. Honey, raw and unfiltered, contains wild yeast, hydrogen peroxide, and glucose oxidase and becomes, when prepared in certain ways, a fermented mead that the Essenes and other Jewish communities consumed in ritual contexts. The land described in Deuteronomy was not described as a land of pharmaceuticals. It was described as a land of food. The food was the medicine. The preparation was the knowledge. The knowledge was given before the need was fully understood. Here is the practical layer, because this is meant to be useful. For gut barrier restoration, traditionally fermented kefir from living grains, 200 milliliters daily, taken in the morning on a relatively empty stomach, not sweetened, not filtered. If If you can only find commercial kefir, choose the highest bacterial count available, full fat, no added sugar, and take it alongside a tablespoon of raw, unfiltered honey to provide prebiotic substrate. 4 to 6 weeks is the minimum period before expecting measurable change. Gut lining turns over rapidly. The cells replace themselves every 3 to 5 days, but the microbial community needs time to establish. For systemic inflammation, traditionally fermented doenjang or miso, consumed daily in small amounts. 1 tablespoon in soup or diluted in warm water. Not boiling, because temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius destroy active enzymes. This is the instruction most modern recipes ignore. You do not add miso to boiling broth. You remove the pot from heat. You wait 2 minutes. Then you add the miso. The enzyme activity that changes everything is lost in seconds above that threshold. For cardiovascular support alongside gut repair, natto, if you can acquire the traditional preparation. 100 grams daily in the morning is the amount used in Japanese observational studies. The taste requires adjustment. The benefit does not require belief. It requires consistency. For children, for the elderly, for those with significant dysbiosis. Water kefir, or traditionally prepared kombucha made from a living SCOBY culture, lower in alcohol than kefir, gentler on a compromised barrier, rich in organic acids that shift gut pH in ways that favor beneficial species. Start with 50 milliliters and build slowly. A compromised gut introduced suddenly to large amounts of live culture can produce temporary discomfort as the microbial balance shifts. That discomfort is sometimes called a healing crisis. It is real, it passes. Reduce the amount and increase gradually. Here is what connects all of it, stated plainly, because it has earned a plain statement. The principle is not that fermented food is good for you. The principle is that the industrialization of the food supply did not just change flavor and convenience, it destroyed the biological transformation step that made food into medicine. It removed the living organisms. It removed the time. It replaced a 3-year fermentation with a 3-day acidulation. A bacterial community of 30 species with 2 strains chosen for predictability and shelf stability. A slow Maillard reaction with a spray of caramel coloring. What modern processing removed is not quality. It is an entirely different category of compound. Compounds that do not exist until the process that creates them is allowed to complete. The ancient world did not romanticize fermentation. It depended on it. From Korean monasteries to German hospitals to Caucasian mountain families to the palace kitchens of the Joseon dynasty, across cultures with no contact, across centuries with no shared language, the same process kept appearing, kept being preserved, kept being passed down with enough institutional seriousness that kingdoms maintained officials to oversee it. That is not coincidence. That is evidence. Evidence accumulated over generations by people who could not afford to be wrong about what kept their bodies working. Modern science is now reading what they wrote, not in scrolls, but in molecular signatures, in bacterial DNA, in the organic residue on 1,000-year-old clay pots. And what it is finding, compound by compound, pathway by pathway, is that they were not primitive approximations of what we now know. They were ahead of us, in the only way that matters. They had more time with the data, which raises one question worth sitting with. If the preparation methods that produce the most powerful biology are the slowest, the most patient, the most dependent on invisible living processes working in darkness over time, and if those methods were known, practiced, institutionalized, and then replaced not because they failed, but because they were inconvenient, what else did we replace for the same reason that we have not yet noticed? That question is worth more than any answer I could give you. Take it with you. If this kind of conversation matters to you, hit like and subscribe and share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me which one surprised you most. I read every single one. New content every week. We are just getting started.